You may have heard about Major Charles Carpenter, the pilot who during World War II strapped bazookas underneath the wings of his tiny artillery spotting aircraft in order to knock out German tanks. Heroic, right? Well, did you know he also faced a firing squad? Everyone should be reminded of the story about Major Charles Carpenter, the World War II artillery liaison pilot that strapped bazookas underneath the wings of the tiny Piper L4 Cub that he named Rosie the Rocketer in order to knock out German tanks and armored vehicles. Definitely heroic. However, there are parts of this World War II story that often remain untold, like the time that he spent in a military prison. So today on History X, we're going to discuss 5 secrets surrounding Major Charles Carpenter and his heroic airborne attacks. Tiny artillery spotting aircraft routinely flew behind enemy lines in order to direct artillery fire on enemy positions. Charles Carpenter flew support missions in the 4th Armored Division in General Patton's 3rd Army. By August of 1945, Major Carpenter had become increasingly frustrated with his inability to attack enemy positions when the artillery he was spotting for was out of range or otherwise unavailable. He therefore decided to take a couple of bazookas, strap them underneath the wings of his 65 horsepower Piper L4 Cub and see what he could do against German armored vehicles and tanks. The first secret we learn about Major Charles Carpenter is that it not only took guts to strap bazookas to his tiny, fabric-covered airplanes and go against German tanks and armored vehicles, it also took a lot of brains. Look, any artillery pilot flying the Piper L4 couldn't strap as many bazookas as he wanted, wherever he wanted, on that airframe. There were weight and balance issues that had to be taken into consideration. The Piper L4 Cub was a lightweight, fabric-covered airframe with a small 65 horsepower engine. It had a weight capacity of just 380 pounds. So by the time you added a pilot and fuel, you were extremely limited on what else you could bring aboard that airplane. A loaded M1A1 bazooka weighs approximately 16 pounds. Multiply that by 6 and you've got 100 pounds that you're bringing aboard that airplane. You also have to take into account the mounting brackets as well as the firing mechanisms for each of those bazookas. Now you're looking at more like 150 pounds that you're bringing aboard an already slow and underpowered aircraft. Now, where exactly can you mount 6 bazookas and all of that gear without impacting the flight characteristics of the Piper L4? Well, the ideal position may appear obvious, underneath the wings, but it's not that simple, and here's why. The Piper L4 is a tail-dragging aircraft, meaning the center of gravity falls behind the main landing gear. If you added any weight to the plane that shifted the center of gravity forward of those wheels, now all of a sudden you've created an unstable aircraft and you're taking the chance of nosing over upon takeoff or landing. But the fact that a Piper L4 is a tail dragger worked in Major Charles Carpenter's favor. Taking a closer look at a loaded bazooka, the center of gravity falls to the back third of the bazooka. So with these hanging underneath the wings of his Piper L4, it falls right in the sweet spot of where the center of gravity needs to be on his tail-dragging airplane. He finally settled on mounting the bazookas on the lifting struts just outboard of the jury struts. Okay, so Major Charles Carpenter mounted some bazookas underneath the wings, all set to go kill German tanks, right? During the initial test, he was shooting rockets all over the place, everywhere except his intended targets. He quickly found out that other factors like winds aloft, weather, visibility, range from the target, all impacted his ability to even come close to hitting anything. He finally settled on the ideal distance from target to only about 100 yards. He then adjusted the mounts and the bore sightings of each bazooka so that they converged 100 yards in front of the nose of his Piper Cub. Once he spotted enemy armored positions at about 1,500 feet above the ground, he would nosedive his plane, and once he reached 100 yards from his target, only then would he fire his bazookas. And like anything else, it took a lot of practice. But all of those calculations, that trial and error, that practice, eventually started paying off, and he started earning kills against enemy armored positions. Did you know that Major Carpenter spent time in a military prison and actually faced a firing squad? While riding around in a Jeep scouting potential landing sites for his plane, Major Carpenter came across a jumble of Allied tanks and soldiers gathered outside the vital town of Avranches. They'd become disorganized by a German artillery barrage, which was fired to prevent the Americans from taking the town. But Major Carpenter was having none of it. He jumped on the lead Sherman tank, grabbed the .50 caliber machine gun, and fired a burst. Then he yelled to the American soldiers, "Let's go," leading them into the town and forcing the Germans to retreat. Again, heroic, right? They took the town in a matter of minutes. But Major Carpenter wasn't satisfied. He stayed on the Sherman and drove after the retreating Nazi tanks. They'd approach a street corner, and Carpenter would have the Sherman fire the next round at the retreating German tank. And they did that corner by corner until they rounded the next corner, and in the middle of all the smoke and dust, he had the Sherman tank fire the next round at the German retreating tank. Except it wasn't a German tank at all. It was another Sherman with a dozer blade attached to it, clearing a burning enemy vehicle out of the way. Fortunately, no friendly soldiers or tank crew were killed. However, they were really pissed, and that round from the Sherman tank that Carpenter was on had blown that dozer blade off of the friendly tank. Okay, look, Carpenter wasn't supposed to be there. This wasn't his division. He was simply supposed to be scouting for landing sites. So he was arrested and put in a military prison and ultimately faced a firing squad for putting friendly soldiers at risk. Thankfully, his commanding officer heard about all of this, showed up, and intervened. Major Carpenter no longer faced a firing squad, but he still faced a court-martial. Then General Patton stepped in. Once Patton heard about Major Carpenter jumping on the Sherman tank to lead the push to drive the Germans out of the town, Patton was quoted as saying this was the kind of fighting man he wanted in his army. Now, I'm not 100% sure, this is where it gets kind of fuzzy, but I think this is where Major Charles Carpenter earned his first Bronze Star. If you know for a fact, please comment in the comments section below, because I'd like to get that part straight. Now, thank God Major Carpenter never faced that firing squad, because now we're going to fast forward to the Battle of Ericourt, the battle that made Major Charles Carpenter famous. On September 20th, 1944, German tanks pinned down a couple of support units from the 4th Armored Division near the French town of Ericourt. Now, when Major Carpenter heard about this, he immediately jumped in his plane and took off. The only problem was the entire battlefield was covered with fog until it finally cleared around noon. And that's when he spotted several German armored vehicles and tanks, and he dove to attack and fire his bazookas. Now, typically when the enemy sees small artillery spotting aircraft in the sky, they don't fire. It'll reveal their position, allowing that spotter aircraft to redirect the artillery fire. Now, in this case, the Battle of Ericourt, the Germans were surprised by this tiny spotting aircraft that was diving on them and firing bazookas at their valuable Tiger tanks. And once they got over this initial surprise, they eventually returned fire with everything they had. But Major Carpenter wasn't hit at all. In fact, once Carpenter fired all of his bazookas, he landed, refueled, reloaded his bazookas, and took off again for a second attack. But this time, the Germans were ready for him. They didn't hide from the spotter aircraft. Instead, they continued to fire everything they had, and Carpenter did the unthinkable. He fired all 6 bazookas, got away without a scratch, returned to base, refueled, reloaded yet again, and returned for a 3rd attack. That day, Major Charles Carpenter, in his fabric-covered Piper L4, fired a total of 16 bazooka rockets, destroying 2 German tanks, several armored vehicles, and killing or wounding at least a dozen German soldiers. Why was this style of attack so successful? Even though the bazooka warheads were relatively ineffective when fired at ground level against the thicker frontal armor of the German enemy tanks, the bazookas were actually very effective when fired from an elevated position or from the air against the thinner armor on top of the tanks. Basically, it was an ideal position. It made for easy pickings for a diving Major Carpenter in his spotter aircraft. By the end of his military career, Major Carpenter was credited with destroying 6 enemy tanks. But did you know that he actually knocked out closer to 14? In order to certify a kill, it had to be confirmed by an independent observer, somebody else that had seen the kill take place. And unfortunately, there were 8 tank hits that had never been spotted or seen from another observer. Regardless, these heroics garnered a lot of attention from reporters requesting interviews, from magazines like Stars and Stripes, the Associated Press, Popular Science, New York Sun, and Liberty Magazine, just to name a few. In fact, when Major Carpenter was interviewed by Stars and Stripes magazine, and I've got my computer here because I want to get this right, after he was credited with destroying his 5th enemy tank, he told the reporter, quote, "Word must be getting around to watch out for Cubs with bazookas on them. Every time I show up now, they shoot with everything they have. They never used to bother Cubs. Bazookas must be bothering them a bit." In another article, Carpenter was quoted as saying his idea of war was, quote, "to attack, and attack again," end quote. While Major Charles Carpenter is probably the most famous example of someone strapping bazookas to his artillery spotting aircraft, there were several others, such as Lieutenants Roy Carson and Harley Merrick. They also armed their Piper Cubs with bazookas. So what became of Major Charles Carpenter at the end of World War II? Well, unfortunately, he became very sick. Yes, in 1945, Major Carpenter, after all of his heroics, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. Basically, he had cancer. Doctors informed him that he had just 2 years to live. So in 1946, after being promoted to the rank of lieutenant colonel and awarded the Silver Star, he was honorably discharged. But in true Charles Carpenter fashion, he beat the odds yet again. He lived for an additional 20 years, and he went back to work as a high school history teacher until his death at the age of 53 in 1966. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Carpenter, awarded the Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Bronze Star. To access unedited versions of this and many other History X videos, consider becoming a History X member. You don't think I would end this video without letting you know what happened to his plane, Rosie the Rocketer, do you? When Carpenter received his cancer diagnosis in 1945, Rosie the Rocketer was assigned to another pilot until the war ended. Then Rosie was sold as military surplus to a gentleman in Switzerland, where she remained for 11 years and was painted yellow. Then in 1956, she was sold to an Austrian aero club, where this proud plane was relegated to towing gliders. So what finally became of Rosie the Rocketer? Well, in 2017, it was gathering dust in an Austrian aviation museum until it was found and purchased by the Collings Foundation, which is a foundation in Massachusetts that promotes the preservation of military aircraft. Rosie was shipped back to the United States and then underwent a restoration that lasted for nearly 2 years. The restoration was actually recently completed in July of 2020. And Charles Carpenter's granddaughter, who is a graphic designer, actually repainted the Rosie the Rocketer logo on the side of the plane. Rosie is now on display at the Collings Foundation in Massachusetts.